This is TWiT.
Apple says, oh, never mind. We spent many hours talking about Apple's child sexual abuse material detection. Larry, I should actually start with you because you are very active in protecting children online. Apple, as everybody knows, because we talked about it ad nauseum, was going to use the database from NCMEC. You work closely with NCMEC, the National Center.
I was on their board for 20 years.
Missing exploited children. They're an organization started and funded by the government, but non-governmental. They're a nonprofit. Right. But they do maintain, and they're the only place legally allowed to maintain, a database of child sexual abuse material. They create a fingerprint hash that almost everybody uses to detect it on their own servers. So they don't have to send the images around, just the fingerprint. And Google, Microsoft, Facebook, everybody uses this to detect it. Apple's proposal was a little different. Instead of scanning right there on iCloud, as everybody else does, Apple wanted to scan the images on their way to iCloud. In other words, put the scanner on your phone. And I don't know if that was what triggered people, but there was something about this sacrosanct phone that made people say, no, Apple. And Apple's, I think, listening.
Might have been all those ads Apple ran that said what happens in your phone stays in your phone.
Yeah, Apple might have.
That could have been why people thought this about their iPhones.
Yeah, I think you're right. They created expectations. And of course, Apple fought the good fight with the FBI around the time when the FBI wanted to break their encryption around the San Bernardino shooter. The thing but I think Apple really had a bad messaging over this. I mean, part of the problem is the kind of stuff that Apple would have reported to NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I don't want to go into it on this show, but this is not pictures of topless 17-year-olds.
Oh, no,
this
it's
is
horrible,
really horrible stuff.
We can stipulate that. Yeah. And I think it's important, and I'm going to let you talk in a second, but I think it's important to say right up front, nobody who was opposed to this was in favor of this imagery, child pornography, pederasty of any kind. Nobody was saying that. But there is also this notion that if a company wants to do something intrusive, they wrap it in, think of the children or terrorism, they wrap it in these hot button subjects, so that deflects criticism. Right. So I just want to say that up front. Nobody's proposing that this stuff should exist. Everybody says, yes, it's a good idea to come up with stuff. In fact, I'm going to go a step farther. I don't think anybody is mad at Facebook or Microsoft or Google for doing the same thing on their cloud servers. In fact, Google does it with Gmail attachments. And nobody said boo about that.
Right. And in fact, they're obligated. If it shows up on their servers, and if their algorithm matching software, which, by the way, was developed by Microsoft, it's called PhotoDNI, if it spots it or if it gets a hit against the NCMEC database, then they are legally obligated to report it to the cyber tip line, which is operated by the National Center. And I think that's a good model. I think part of Apple's problem is, again, on one hand, I think they were thinking that by doing this on the device, they were actually making for greater privacy for their users, but it really confused the matter and created a backlash, which was probably fair. I'm not saying it's unfair, but it was unfortunate because they were trying to do the right thing.
You say the benefits, you actually wrote an article about this last month, outweigh the risks. But has your mind been changed in the 3 weeks since by the conversation?
To some extent. I think if I were to rewrite that article today, I would say they need to figure out a way to reduce the risks and, to enhance the benefits. Because I think, again, if they move it to the iCloud server and stop scanning on the phone, then I would say the risks are very well under control.
And I don't think anybody would object to that because this is what everybody does.
I was just trying to make the point that there's a really good reason to do this. And I also made the point that there are always risks in any form of surveillance. Look, I've got a doorbell camera. I think it has great benefits. But does that mean that if you decide to walk in front of my house with somebody you shouldn't be with, that your privacy could be invaded? Absolutely. And so we have to figure out all of these trade-offs, in the world that we live in right now.
Apple obviously feeling the heat. They were planning to roll this out with iOS 15, which I'm going to guess would have rolled out this month. I think that's pretty safe. Have decided to delay it. I don't know if they're going to wait until the heat cools off and then do it, or if they're going to find a better way to do it. It'd be my guess that what Apple did not want to do what you suggested, Larry, because ultimately they'd like to have end-to-end encryption on iCloud so that they can avoid subpoenas from law enforcement in this country and other countries. They can avoid that whole thing by putting end-to-end encryption on iCloud, which means the only way they could find those images is on their way in or on their way out.
Yeah. And by the way, encryption is, having been on the board of the National Center, most of my colleagues were very anti-encryption. And I argued that encryption actually protects children along with everyone else, so that there are pros and cons from the safety standpoint. Forget other issues. From a safety standpoint, there are advantages to encryption as well as some risks that it brings in, or at least hamperings of law enforcement.
And it very well could be that. I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
That Apple's rationale was based on this kind of reductionist, lack of nuance conversation that has happened with their peers, particularly Facebook, and their peers also acquire the language around safety and encryption to talk about how your content is protected. But there really has been an unnuanced debate about this exact topic, and many of Apple's peers have kind of confused it and harmed public trust. So it could have been that Apple was maybe trying to do exactly what you suggested. I don't know, but I think it could have been that they're looking for a simpler solution.
Yeah, I'm not sure who you're talking about. So Facebook is getting a lot of flack from law enforcement and many in the child safety community. Not me, but others.
I was talking about Facebook specifically.
Yeah.
Well, Facebook and Google and anyone who's doing encryption is bound to get flack from law enforcement and some people in child protection. And if they don't do it, they're going to get flack from everybody else.
But Facebook reported more than 20 million images matching the NCMEC database in 2020. Yeah. Apple reported 256. 20 million from Facebook, 256 from Apple. I think that number alone was one of the reasons Apple said, we got to do something. This does not look good, if nothing else. The optics are good.
The main question here, and from my perspective, is where's the consistency for Apple? So if we look back to the time where the company had the showdown with the FBI over the San Bernardino terrorist's phone, the key wasn't, should we protect this, this data that could potentially lead us to solve like what might be, a terrorist network operating in the U.S. or foil the next attack. Apple's argument was, if we are to create this key, we are going to create this opportunity for it to be used in the future for things that are not this specific. We're going to open the door. So therefore, we're not touching this at all. And while this is a valiant attempt, it doesn't sync with the same logic they had back with the FBI case, where they're not going to allow anything to happen on device because you don't know what it's going to be used for next. And I think that's where they really get into trouble.
What the EFF and many experts were worried about with Apple's scanning on the phone is that then the government could come to Apple and said, well, by the way, we'd also like you to find an image of gay kissing or something if it's Saudi Arabia. And as a result, that would be problematic. There were other issues as well. In fact, one of the things Apple seems to cite is that some of the there were a lot of technologists using these neural hashes who said, you're going to have a problem. It's not that accurate. Apple said specifically, we want to make improvements before releasing these critically important child safety features. It's interesting. NCMEC warned Apple at the very beginning. This was another thing that lit a bit of a fire, saying you're going to hear, what was it, Larry, shrieking commentators decrying what you're doing. Pay no attention to them.
Well, that may have been a mistake at NCMEC. Again,
no kidding.
I stepped down from the board a year ago, so I can't take any responsibility. But there are people who in NCMEC who get it, and there are people who don't. And the ones who get it understand that we cannot use child protection as an excuse for surveillance. In 2012, I was supposed to give 2 speeches in Moscow. And I gave my first speech to a group of basically NGOs where I argued that you cannot combine child protection or child pornography with other harms. And that was exactly what Putin and his team were doing.
It's worse than anything else is what you're saying.
Yeah. You've got to just focus on that. But Putin and company created this law that lumped all of these things, terrorism, child pornography, extremism, into one law. And guess what? The next speech I was supposed to give, suddenly they ran out of time right before I was about to speak. And that was at a big government televised event. So they didn't like my message, clearly.
Wow, that's pretty blatant.
Yeah, very blatant.
But
Very
so
obvious.
you're making the point that Apple's running and by the way, Apple may back down at this point or delay it, but by having announced that they can do it, they've already opened the door to this.
Yeah.
Because in effect, you've said, well, we could do it, and Russia or Saudi Arabia or China could use that as, well, we know you can do it, so do it.
It also makes you wonder what's actually behind the privacy messaging that Apple's been pushing at us for the last, few years. Is this actually a message based off of principles and values, or is it a convenient marketing message to help position the iPhone against Facebook and the iPhone against Android? And that's why I brought up consistency earlier. If you're consistent with it, we can say, okay, these are your values. But if you say privacy for this, but not for that, and that's what Apple stands for, privacy, then you have to start scratching your head and you say, maybe this company isn't as, devoted to privacy as a value as we once thought. Now, of course, Leo, you mentioned that this is not something that anybody would, want. We wouldn't want these images out there at all.
Well, that's the question. Can we have privacy and block child pornography at the same time?
Well, you can have you can have
both.
full safety in a society and be under authoritarian rule, and it's always a balance of how much safety do you want and how authoritarian do you want to be.
Exactly.
And so this is the decision that Apple made.
This debate, this exact same debate, is raging internally with Apple right now with their own employees, and they've had significant issues with the Apple II movement. Cher Scarlett coming forward over the last couple of weeks and talking about how, look, there can be privacy for some things and security for some things at Apple. In fact, she told me, we have privacy and security for our devices and our products, but not our people. Our people are exposed if they speak out against Apple. And I think that this, Alex, consistency is the exact same at the core, the exact same argument that's happening with Apple right now with their own employees.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, it's a fascinating moment for Apple because, from my understanding, there have been departments inside the company that have deployed Slack. And when you put these messaging apps inside a company, all these things that you used to have in terms of culture, whether it was top-down leadership or silos like Apple has had, or a culture where you don't ask questions to people above you, which Apple has had, that falls by the wayside. So I think we're entering an extremely fascinating moment for this company where we see whether it can maintain this siloed, secretive culture, one that doesn't empower employees to speak up, unlike Facebook and Google, or whether Apple shuts down Slack and says we're going to keep doing things the way we've been doing, and how that impacts employee morale. So the cat's been let out of the bag, and I kind of think it's an exciting moment because their culture did need to be tested, and I'm glad to see that we're starting to see the beginning of that.
You're probably referring to the fact that Apple, which uses Slack for internal messaging, banned a Slack channel that was talking about pay equity, saying we don't allow personal conversations on our business Slack. Meanwhile, there's a dogs channel and others that they did not ban. So they ban it. They used a completely pathetic excuse for doing so. Apple employees have Slack channels to discuss #FunDogs, more than 5,000 members, #Gaming, 3,000 members. There's a 2,000 member Dad Jokes channel, but don't have a channel discussing pay equity.
In partial defense of Apple, not around the pay equity issue, but around the whole issue of encryption and data collection, the entire safety community that I'm very much part of deals with nuances. So, for example, as an ACLU member, I feel very, very strongly about free speech, but I also feel very strongly about hate speech and about misinformation.
Of course, and the ACLU is famous for defending the Skokie, Illinois Nazis.
Exactly. But these are competing. In other words, there are competing rights or competing issues that, aside from any commercial questions, aside from the fact whether these are greedy corporations trying to extract every possible penny, these companies, and I can't speak so much for Apple because they're not one of our partners, but certainly Facebook, Twitter, Google, companies we do work with, Microsoft, they do struggle with these questions of how do we balance these competing rights, right of safety.
The difference
versus
is,
right of speech, et cetera.
as Alex has pointed out, they don't have big advertisements saying what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone.
Well, exactly. That's true too.
Apple's kind of walked into this buzzsaw, and so let me ask you, Larry: is it compatible, privacy of your device and protecting against child sexual abuse material? Are those? I understand you're saying it's nuanced. You have to weigh them, but they seem like they're at direct odds. I mean, what I do on my phone is private. It's my personal phone, and people are. Yeah. This is the part of the problem is this is a new device. It's a new concept that I would store such personal stuff on a device that's always connected to the internet, has a microphone, a camera, and a GPS. Is right there, this kind of paradox.
They are in conflict, but it's not as if that law enforcement has no resources at all. I mean, there's metadata, for example, which can be used. I mean, it's not unlike the whole wiretapping rules. I mean, what you can access and what you can't. And law enforcement, I'm sure if they would love to have a complete access to every device in the world. They don't, but they still have tools that they can use to bust bad guys. And it's just going to, it's going to be harder for them, not because we want to make their job harder, but because we want to, as much as possible, protect the rights of citizens.
Balance privacy. This is what the Constitution's all about. Balance privacy, because the founders were concerned about the King of England going into their home and looking for stuff. That's why there's a Fourth Amendment, and they balance this need for law enforcement versus this need and constitutional right, not just need, but a right to privacy of your personal effects. Yeah. And I guess the courts can weigh in on this. That's certainly, part of their job. I don't know. I don't know where I stand on this. No one's supporting CSAM. No one's supporting these horrible people in what they do. And by the way, Apple didn't roll it out. They pre-announced it. So you might argue, as John Gruber on Daring Fireball has, this is exactly what Apple's intent was, to start this conversation. So it may not be that Apple was acting irresponsibly, that they were saying, well, we want to do this. What do you think? And they heard, and admittedly, late afternoon on Friday and a long weekend maybe is not the most newsworthy time to announce an embarrassing backing down, but they did back down. Now we'll see what happens in the long run. Yeah. They also, and Larry, I got to ask you this, they also told us how, if you're a child pornographer, you can avoid it. Just turn off iCloud photos, and it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and you can find another way to share the data, like through an encrypted service. So it's not as if, and that's interesting you point that out, because this material will exist with or without what Apple is planning on doing. Unfortunately, these guys will go to any lengths to get to share this kind of material. So
what's the point of even trying to enforce this? I mean, I don't know, maybe child pornographers are particularly stupid people, but it's not going to, maybe
they're not. Well, I mean,
I have to admit, I've told this story before, but when Patrick Norton and I were talking to the Secret Service about forensics and so forth, one of the guys said, the truth is most crooks are stupid, and we'll even just hand you the password. So you don't, most cases, it's easy to catch these guys. I don't know if that's true now, but Apple, it sounds like, to be honest, Apple was doing this for PR, because there is a way to turn it off. And somebody who's actually doing this, by pre-announcing it, they're saying, hey, if you want to keep doing it, turn off iCloud Photo. So it's going to have zero impact in enforcement. It's a public relations move.
Much like most of their proclamations on privacy over the past few years.
And the only real problem is it's a PR move in contradiction to what they've been saying up to now. In both cases, it's PR. It's marketing. Your iCloud was never private, by the way. In fact, that's what they told the San Bernardino, the FBI in the San Bernardino case. They said, had you brought the phone back to his house, it probably would have connected to iCloud and synced up, and we would have been glad to hand that data over.
Or they would have been forced to, even if they didn't do it voluntarily.
Yeah, maybe they're not glad. I can't impute
but they could be subpoenaed, clearly.
Their feelings
anything
about
in the
it.
Cloud.
But we know that they often hand over data from the cloud.
Sure.
Because they have
and that's the thing. And the problem is, if it's encrypted on its way to the cloud, it may be impenetrable, and that's the problem for law enforcement.
I honestly think that Apple, and they haven't said this, wanted to turn on end-to-end encryption for the cloud. They had mentioned this before, and apparently, according to some sources, were talked out of it by the FBI. But I think Apple would, and maybe the plan was for Apple to turn that on and say, but look, we're giving law enforcement a way to scan this before it gets to the cloud, and that's all we're going to give them. So maybe
the other danger is,
this was all about
Apple
Apple protecting privacy.
What if somebody steals your phone? Can they get access to this kind of data?
No, that's the whole point. That's why the FBI San Bernardino case was such a big deal. Apple said under no circumstances are we going to allow even law enforcement to unlock that phone. That phone is sacrosanct. It's encrypted.
Right.
So what about that, Alex? Well, maybe this is more PR.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that it's very reasonable that we brought up Facebook as the other company that we're comparing Apple to when it comes to detecting these images. I'll tell you why. Apple and Facebook are competitors in ways that people don't speak about enough. We talk about Apple and Android. But the truth is that Facebook has the set of messaging apps that will allow people to unhook themselves from the Apple ecosystem and move to Android. And in fact, they're probably going to prevent a lot of iPhone penetration in countries where WhatsApp is strong, because you use your phone for messaging primarily. It's the most important thing you do on your phone. And so Apple sees Facebook as this ultimate competitor. And that's why you've seen all these ads about what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. It's because the company is positioning itself against Facebook because it doesn't want you using those messaging apps. So you stay on iMessage, and you stay on iPhones, and you keep upgrading. You buy your next Mac, and you buy your next iPhone, and the list goes on. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to PR, that's why privacy has been the most, and I've been hinting at it at this point, but I might as well come out and say it explicitly. I think that's why privacy has been at the core of Apple's marketing efforts, Facebook number one, and then, of course, positioning itself against Android number two to make itself a luxury product. So at the end of the day, Leo, I think what you're pointing on is extremely salient and sort of core to the whole deal with Apple at this point, which is that the company is going to scare you about the other company's privacy in order to keep you inside its ecosystem, in order to keep Facebook weak and under the gaze of regulators and third parties, while Apple sits out and says, okay, I'm doing good. And
to reduce Facebook to an app that sits on the iPhone.
Correct, exactly.
Sorry to interrupt
so I think what
we've
seen
convince you to
here,
pay twice as much for an iPhone than an Android
exactly.
phone.
Yes, everybody together.
Privacy.
And so I think what we've seen here is exactly the case. It's Apple all of a sudden, and that's again, it comes to consistency. Apple tried to make this PR move, showed that it was inconsistent, that it didn't really care as much about the privacy as it might actually be saying, and it was all about the public relations and the marketing impact. Steve Jobs back in the day said marketing is all about who you are and what you stand for, right? And so that's what they're trying to say. They stand for privacy. But when you start to peel back the layers a little bit, you see that this isn't exactly the big angel that it makes itself out to be. And that's, I think, what's being exposed in this moment.